Behind the doors of the Roman imperial palace, love was never just love. A marriage could decide the future of the empire. A bedroom rumor could destroy a dynasty. A whispered accusation of lust, incest, or betrayal could become sharper than a senator's knife. Nero, Caligula, Claudius, Augustus. Their private lives were watched, judged, exaggerated, and weaponized. In Rome, the emperor's body belonged partly to the state. His desires became political evidence. His scandals became public warnings. And after midnight, the palace was not only a home, it was a battlefield. But to understand these stories, we have to move carefully. The ancient sources do not hand us clean truth. They give us memory, accusation, gossip, moral judgment, and sometimes genuine fragments of danger. So we enter slowly, not to repeat every scandal, but to ask why Rome needed these scandals to survive. The palace after dark was a strange kind of theater, not the grand theater of marble seats and applauding crowds, but a quieter stage where family, ambition, fear, and desire crossed into one another until no one could tell where intimacy ended and power began. An emperor's marriage was a political arrangement. His heirs were a national concern. His lovers could become threats. His women could be praised as symbols of virtue one year and condemned as monsters the next. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Because the real mystery is not simply what Nero or Caligula did behind closed doors. It is how Rome turned those closed doors into a judgment on power itself. Long before Nero stepped onto his private stage, before Caligula turned the imperial household into a story of dread, Rome already believed that private life had public consequences. This is one of the first things we have to understand. The Romans were not shocked by imperial scandal simply because they were naive about desire. They were not a delicate people fainting at the thought of adultery. Roman society could be brutally practical, politically ruthless, and often deeply familiar with the gap between public virtue and private conduct. What disturbed them was something more specific: the fear that the ruler's household might become the weak point of the state. Marriage, in the Roman imagination, was never only romance. It was property, alliance, reputation, bloodline. A legal bond, certainly, but also a public statement about rank, discipline, and continuity. For elite families, a marriage could mend a feud, secure a faction, absorb a fortune, or place a child one careful step closer to power. A husband was expected to govern his household with control. A wife was expected to guard the honor of the family, especially through sexual fidelity and legitimate children. The ideal was orderly, even when reality was not. And at the center of that ideal stood the Roman father. The paterfamilias was more than a parent. He was the legal and symbolic head of the household, the man through whom ancestry, property, and authority passed. His home was not imagined as a soft refuge from politics. It was the first school of power. If a man could not govern his household, how could he govern a province? If he could not command his own appetites, how could he command armies? This was the moral logic Roman writers loved to repeat, especially when they were sharpening their pens against a hated emperor. Of course, this logic was selective. Rome tolerated much in powerful men that it condemned in women. Male sexual behavior was judged less by modern ideas of mutual fidelity and more by questions of status, dominance, self-control, and public embarrassment. A Roman aristocrat might survive a great deal of private vice if it did not humiliate his name, blur social boundaries, or suggest that he had become ruled by appetite. The scandal was not always desire itself. The scandal was disorder. That word matters. Disorder was what Romans feared in the body politic, and the household became a miniature version of the republic they had lost. A woman accused of adultery was not merely accused of passion. She could be imagined as introducing uncertainty into the bloodline. A son born under suspicion could become a political problem. A lover could become an advisor. A spouse could become a faction. A bedroom could become a place where access to power was negotiated without the Senate, without the army, without the old forms that gave aristocrats the comforting illusion that Rome still belonged to them. Then came the empire, and everything tightened. Under the Republic, elite families competed with one another, and scandals could wound reputations. Under the emperors, the private conduct of one household carried the weight of the whole world. The imperial family was not just another noble clan. It was the machinery of succession. It was the face of stability. Every marriage hinted at a future. Every pregnancy carried political meaning. Every divorce could rearrange alliances. Every rumor about a wife, sister, mother, or lover could be read as evidence that the palace itself had been captured by corruption. This is why the love lives of emperors became so dangerous to write about and so irresistible to remember. A modern viewer might be tempted to separate the two stories. The real politics over here, the gossip over there. But ancient Rome did not make that division so cleanly. Desire could be political because access was political. A person who shared the emperor's table, his bed, his trust, or even his attention could influence petitions, appointments, punishments, and favors. Whether that influence was real in every case is another question. Often, the suspicion was enough. The Romans also cared intensely about masculinity, though not in a simple way. Their ideal ruler was expected to appear disciplined, commanding, fertile, and controlled. He should produce heirs, but not appear enslaved by pleasure. He should dominate the stage of public life, not seem to perform upon it for applause. He should embody Rome's mastery, not make Rome feel that it was being dragged into some private theater of indulgence. This is why later accusations against emperors so often attack the same points. They accuse them of excess, passivity, theatricality, feminine influence, foreign luxury, incest, adultery, and humiliation. Some of these accusations may preserve real events. Others may be moralizing inventions, or at least stories enlarged by hostility. But they are rarely random. They tell us what Roman elites thought a bad ruler looked like. A bad ruler, in their imagination, was not merely cruel. He was uncontrolled. He could not master his body. He could not master his household. He could not protect the line of succession from scandal. He allowed women, freedmen, actors, lovers, or flatterers too near the center of command. His palace became porous. His family became suspect. His pleasures became public business. And this is where the old Roman ideals begin to look less like stable principles and more like weapons. Virtue was praised, but also used. Modesty was admired, but also demanded unevenly. Female chastity became a political language, especially when men wanted to condemn a dynasty. The accusation of sexual misconduct could make a political enemy seem not just mistaken, but unnatural, polluted, unfit to rule. That does not mean every scandal was false. It means the form of the scandal matters. When Roman writers tell us about imperial lust, they are often doing more than describing behavior. They are building an argument. They are saying, look at the household, and you will understand the reign. Look at the marriage, and you will see the corruption of power. Look at the emperor's bed, and you will see the empire's sickness. This is not evidence we can accept blindly, but neither can we dismiss it as meaningless gossip. Gossip has a history of its own. It travels where official records are silent. It reveals what people feared, what they enjoyed condemning, and what kind of stories seemed believable in a particular culture. A rumor does not have to be true to be important. Sometimes its importance lies in the fact that people wanted it to be true, or needed it to explain what frightened them. So before the famous names appear, before Augustus tries to legislate virtue, before Tiberius vanishes into the rumors of Capri, before Caligula's sisters become symbols of dynastic unease, before Nero's marriages turn into accusations of collapse, we have to hold this foundation in mind. In Rome, private life was never sealed away from public judgment. The household was a political institution. The marriage bed could become a question of legitimacy. The birth of a child could calm the empire or unsettle it. The behavior of an emperor was read like an omen. And when the old republic gave way to one-man rule, the moral expectations once spread across many noble houses gathered around a single family, bright and dangerous as a flame held too close to silk. That is why the scandals endured. Not because Rome was obsessed with bedroom gossip, though it certainly was. Not because every shocking story deserves our trust, but because the Romans believed that character revealed fate. A ruler's desires were not private accidents. They were signs. And in a world where the future of the state might depend on one marriage, one heir, one whispered accusation, love could become a matter of survival. Augustus understood something that later emperors would ignore at their peril. Power does not survive by force alone. It needs a costume. It needs a language. It needs to look inevitable, respectable, almost moral. He had come to rule Rome after decades of civil war, when the old republic had torn itself open and filled its own streets with Roman blood. By the time Augustus stood at the center of the world, Rome was exhausted. It did not only need a victor, it needed a story that made victory feel like restoration. So Augustus offered one. He would not present himself as a king. That word was poisonous in Roman ears. He would be the first citizen, the careful guardian, the man who repaired temples, revived old customs, honored marriage, praised fertility, and spoke as if the moral order of the past could be summoned back into the present by law. Rome, in his vision, would not simply be governed. It would be corrected. This is where the imperial bedroom first becomes official business. Augustus did not invent Roman anxiety about marriage and sexual conduct, but he gave it new machinery. His moral legislation tried to encourage marriage, punish adultery, promote legitimate children, and shape the behavior of the elite. On paper, This looked like a campaign for discipline. After so much political chaos, the household would become a place where Rome rediscovered order. Citizens would marry. Families would grow. The ruling class would behave as if private pleasure must answer to public duty. There was something sincere in this, perhaps. Augustus had seen what elite ambition could do when it was detached from restraint. He knew that the Republic had not collapsed because Romans lacked laws. It had collapsed because the most powerful men had learned how to treat every law as an obstacle. Moral reform gave his new regime a kind of old-fashioned dignity. It allowed him to say that one-man rule was not tyranny, but medicine. Yet medicine can have an unpleasant taste when the doctor's own household is ill. The problem for Augustus was that imperial respectability depended on turning his family into an example. His marriage, his daughter, his grandsons, his heirs, all of them became part of the public image. The dynasty had to look clean, fertile, disciplined, Roman. But families rarely cooperate with propaganda. They breathe, they desire, they disappoint, they refuse to remain symbols. At the center of this contradiction stood Julia, Augustus's only biological child. Julia was not simply a daughter in the modern private sense. She was a dynastic instrument, a living bridge between Augustus and the future he was trying to build. Her marriages were not accidents of affection. They were political arrangements. Through her, Augustus could connect powerful men to his bloodline, manage succession, and project stability beyond his own lifetime. But Julia also became the scandal that exposed the fragility of his moral project. Ancient accounts accuse her of adultery and sexual misconduct. And while the details come through hostile and moralizing traditions, the political result is clear enough. Augustus exiled her. The man who had legislated against adultery now punished his own daughter under the moral order he had helped create. It was a devastatingly public act. It showed resolve, yes, but it also showed that even the founder of imperial respectability could not fully control the human reality inside his own house. And this is the detail that changes the story. Julia's fall was not just a family tragedy. It was a collision between law, image, and blood. Had she been someone else's daughter, her punishment might have served Augustus's moral campaign neatly. It would have demonstrated that the new Rome was serious. But because she was his daughter, every accusation against her reflected back onto him. The scandal did not merely say that Julia had failed. It suggested that the imperial household, the supposed model of Roman order, contained the same unruly forces Augustus claimed to be correcting in everyone else. That is the trap of moral politics. Once a ruler makes virtue part of his authority, every private failure becomes evidence against the regime. We should be cautious here. The surviving stories about Julia were shaped by writers with their own assumptions about women, sexuality, and imperial power. A woman at the center of succession politics could easily become a screen onto which male authors projected fears of appetite and disorder. The language of sexual scandal often simplified more complicated political tensions. Julia may have been guilty of some misconduct. She may also have been caught in a larger struggle over heirs, alliances, and control. The evidence does not allow us to enter her mind, and it certainly does not allow us to treat every ancient accusation as neutral reporting. What we can say with more confidence is that Augustus made his household inseparable from the state, and then discovered the cost. His family was supposed to solve the problem of succession. Instead, It kept revealing how unstable succession could be. Sons-in-law died. Heirs disappointed. Promising young men vanished from the political future through illness, death, or disgrace. Marriage ties that looked secure on parchment became brittle in life. The new imperial system needed a dynasty, but dynasties are made of people, and people are notoriously poor materials for perfect architecture. There is a quiet irony in Augustus's reign. He built a political order that would outlast him, yet he spent much of his later life trying to manage the failures of inheritance. He made morality a public language, then had to speak that language against his own child. He presented himself as the restorer of old Roman discipline, yet his power depended on a new reality. One family had become the center of everything. This is why Augustus belongs at the beginning of the story, even though later emperors would become far more infamous. His scandals were not as lurid as those attached to Caligula or Nero. His palace does not carry the same feverish atmosphere in the ancient imagination, but he created the stage on which their scandals would later make sense. He taught Rome to look at the emperor's household as a mirror of the empire. If the family was orderly, Rome could imagine itself stable. If the marriages were respectable, succession seemed safer. If the women appeared modest, the bloodline seemed protected. If the children looked legitimate, the future felt less frightening. But if that household cracked, the crack seemed to run through the whole political world. The old republic had been a contest among many aristocratic families. Augustus narrowed the focus. He did not abolish politics. He pulled it inward, into marriages, into adoptions, into nursery rooms, into the reputation of daughters and wives, into the dangerous question of who had the right to inherit power over Rome. And once politics entered the family so completely, it could never be removed. That is the real invention of imperial respectability. It was not merely a set of laws about marriage, it was a performance of control. Augustus tried to show that the new regime could master what the civil wars had unleashed: ambition, appetite, rivalry, instability. But the performance required living actors, and the actors did not always follow the script. So when later Romans told stories of imperial women disgraced, emperors corrupted, heirs threatened, and bedrooms turned into political chambers, they were not inventing the connection from nothing. Augustus had already made that connection central to imperial life. He had dressed monarchy in the clothing of morality, and from that moment onward, every stain on the garment would be noticed. When Augustus died, the empire passed into the hands of a man who had spent much of his life being useful, uncomfortable, and unwanted. Tiberius was not the obvious hero of Rome's new age. He was not radiant in the way imperial propaganda preferred its heirs to be radiant. He had military experience, discipline, ancestry, and a certain cold competence. But he also carried the stiffness of someone who had been used by history rather than loved by it. Augustus had relied on him, adopted him, needed him. Yet the arrangement always seemed marked by necessity rather than warmth. That matters, because Tiberius's reign would become one of the first great lessons in what happens when imperial power becomes emotionally sealed off from public trust. At first, Tiberius was not remembered simply as a monster. Even hostile traditions could not erase his administrative ability. He was careful with finances. He understood the army. He did not rush into foolish expansion. He could appear severe, even old-fashioned, in ways that might have suited Rome's taste for discipline. If Augustus had invented imperial respectability, Tiberius seemed, on the surface, capable of maintaining its colder version. But Rome did not only want competence from an emperor, it wanted presence. The princeps was expected to appear, to listen, to judge, to reassure. He was not a modern private ruler hidden behind institutions. His body in public mattered. His face in the Senate mattered. His willingness to submit to the rituals of Roman political life mattered, even when everyone knew those rituals no longer held their old power. The empire had become a monarchy that still wanted to pretend it was not one, and that pretense required careful performance. Tiberius was never comfortable with that performance. Over time, his relationship with the Senate curdled into suspicion and bitterness. Treason trials, informers, elite fear, and political resentment darkened the atmosphere of his rule. Then, in the later years of his reign, he withdrew from Rome and settled on the island of Capri. And that island became one of the most dangerous places in Roman memory. Capri was physically beautiful, but politically disastrous. It offered distance, privacy, sea air, cliffs, villas, and control over access. For a tired ruler, perhaps it offered relief. For his enemies, it offered something better. A blank space. A palace separated from the capital by water is an invitation to imagination. What cannot be seen can be filled in. What cannot be verified can be sharpened. Secrecy does not need to be guilty in order to become suspicious. This is where the stories begin to darken. Ancient writers, especially hostile ones, preserve lurid claims about Tiberius's sexual life on Capri. Some of these accusations are extremely graphic in their original form, and we do not need to repeat them in detail to understand their function. They portray the emperor as corrupted by isolation, age, appetite, and unchecked power. They suggest that away from Rome, away from witnesses who mattered, he abandoned restraint and turned privacy into degradation. But this is exactly where caution is necessary. The most extreme stories about Tiberius on Capri should be treated as uncertain. They come to us through sources shaped by senatorial hostility, moral judgment, and the ancient habit of explaining bad rule through sexual disorder. That does not mean every claim is false. It means the evidence is not clean. We are looking at Tiberius through a pane of glass that has been scratched by politics. What we can say with more confidence is that Capri became a symbol, not merely a location, but an argument. To later Roman writers, the island allowed them to show what monarchy becomes when it removes itself from public accountability. Rome had long feared kings, not only because kings commanded armies, but because kings were imagined as men whose desires were law. A king could take what he wanted. A king could ignore custom. A king could turn the state into an extension of his household. Tiberius on Capri became the perfect image of that fear. The ruler who no longer needed to face the people he ruled. The irony is that Tiberius may have withdrawn partly because he disliked the falseness of public life. The Senate flattered him, feared him, resented him, and watched every word for danger. The rituals of cooperation between emperor and aristocracy were full of tension. He may have found Rome unbearable, but by leaving, he made the problem worse. Absence gave his enemies a gift. It allowed them to replace an awkward living man with a legend. There is a human tragedy somewhere inside this. though it is not an easy one to soften. Tiberius was powerful beyond ordinary measure, but he also appears profoundly isolated. He had lived under Augustus's shadow, lost people close to him, endured dynastic pressures, and inherited a political system that demanded both supreme authority and theatrical modesty. He had to rule as the master of the Roman world, while pretending not to be a monarch. A more charming man might have survived that contradiction. Tiberius turned inward, and Rome punished him for it. The rumors of Capri are not only stories about sex, they are stories about visibility. Rome wanted to see its ruler, because seeing him was a way of limiting him. Public ritual acted like a thin leash. It did not truly restore republican liberty, but it gave the elite a sense that the emperor still recognized their gaze. When Tiberius slipped beyond that gaze, his private life became a canvas for every anxiety the imperial system had created. This is why the island matters more than the details of any single accusation. Capri showed Rome that an emperor's privacy could become politically intolerable. Augustus had tried to make the imperial household into a model of public virtue. Tiberius made it inaccessible, and inaccessibility created its own scandal. The less Rome knew, the worse it imagined. The farther the emperor moved from public view, the more his unseen desires seemed to explain the visible fear of his reign. There is also a pattern here that will return again and again. When Roman writers disliked an emperor, they often attacked his body, his appetites, his self-control. Cruel policies became evidence of inner corruption. Political secrecy became sexual secrecy. Administrative harshness became moral perversion. The emperor's private life was not described as separate from his rule. It was treated as the hidden source of it. For Tiberius, Capri became that hidden source. A rocky island in the Bay of Naples turned into a moral landscape. Its cliffs suggested danger. Its distance suggested concealment. Its villas suggested luxury. Its closed doors suggested that the emperor had escaped the last restraints of shame. Whether the darkest stories were true, exaggerated, or invented, they helped later Romans make sense of a reign that felt cold, fearful, and remote. And perhaps that is the most revealing point. The legend of Tiberius on Capri tells us less about what can be proven than about what Romans believed power would do when left alone with itself. They imagined that secrecy ripened into vice, that isolation fed cruelty, that an emperor who no longer needed the city's approval would eventually become something less than Roman, less than disciplined, less than fully governed by the moral codes he was supposed to embody. Tiberius may not have been the creature his enemies described, but by withdrawing from Rome, he allowed them to write in the darkness. And once the palace moved out of sight, rumor moved in like a permanent resident. Caligula entered Roman memory less like a ruler than like a warning. His real name was Gaius Caesar, but history remembers the childhood nickname, Caligula, Little Boots, a name given to him when he was a boy dressed in miniature soldier's gear among the legions. It is almost too neat a beginning for the story that followed. A child of the imperial family, adored in military camps, descended from Augustus, surrounded by expectation, grief, danger, and inherited myth. He was not born into an ordinary household. He was born into a family where every affection could become political, and every death could open a path to the throne. When he became emperor, Rome at first had reason to hope. After the cold distance of Tiberius, Caligula seemed young, visible, generous, and alive. The change must have felt almost physical. The city had endured suspicion and withdrawal. Now it saw a prince who could appear among the people, honor his family, spend lavishly, and perform the role of renewal. That early brightness is important. Without it, the later stories lose their shape. Caligula's reign became terrifying to Roman writers, not simply because he was accused of cruelty, but because hope curdled so quickly into dread. The young emperor who seemed to restore warmth to public life became, in hostile tradition, a figure of humiliation, spectacle, and unstable desire. And in the Roman imagination, those things belong together. The accusations against Caligula are among the most infamous in imperial history. Ancient writers claim that he committed incest with his sisters, turned sexual access into a form of insult, violated aristocratic dignity, and treated the bodies of others as props in the theater of his own power. Some stories are more plausible than others. Some are thinly sourced. Some are shaped by the ancient tendency to portray a hated ruler as sexually monstrous. The alleged incest with his sisters, especially, must be marked uncertain. It became central to his legend, but certainty is beyond our reach. Still, even uncertain stories can reveal the structure of fear. Caligula's scandal is not merely that he desired. It is that desire was imagined as something he used. Not a weakness hidden behind curtains, but a weapon brought into public life. In the stories told against him, intimacy becomes domination. A noblewoman is not simply seduced, her husband is humiliated. A family boundary is not merely crossed. The entire logic of dynasty is made obscene. A banquet is not just a meal, it becomes a stage on which rank can be stripped away. For Roman elites, this was a nightmare with a political meaning. The aristocracy could survive an emperor who was distant. It could even survive an emperor who was severe, though not comfortably. But an emperor who laughed at dignity was something else. Roman public life depended on status being visible and carefully ranked. Senators knew where they sat, how they spoke, what honors belonged to them, what insults could not be ignored. The old republic had become hollow in many ways, but aristocratic self-respect still mattered. It was one of the last currencies they possessed. Caligula, as remembered by his enemies, spent that currency for amusement. This is why stories of sexual humiliation cling to him so strongly. They are not only about physical misconduct. They are about the destruction of social distance. The emperor could summon, expose, mock, touch, command, and dismiss. He could make private shame into public knowledge. He could remind the highest families in Rome that their ancient names did not protect them from his appetite or his jokes. And if the stories are exaggerated, the exaggeration itself points towards something real. People believed he had made power feel intimate in the most frightening way. The Roman emperor possessed enormous formal authority, but there were still expectations around behavior. He was supposed to cover domination with courtesy. He was supposed to let the Senate pretend it mattered. He was supposed to preserve the forms even when he controlled the substance. Augustus had been brilliant at this. Tiberius had been poor at it. But his discomfort was inward. Caligula, in the hostile tradition, did something more provocative. He exposed the fraud. If one man truly ruled, why should he flatter those beneath him? That question sits beneath many of the stories about him. When Caligula appears as a performer of cruelty, he is often performing the truth that Rome did not want to say aloud. The Senate was no longer sovereign. Noble blood no longer guaranteed safety. A man could be consul, priest, general, descendant of heroes, and still be reduced to fear by a young emperor's mood. Sexual scandal gave Roman writers a language for that humiliation. To accuse Caligula of incest was to say that he had corrupted the dynasty at its source. The imperial family was supposed to secure legitimacy through blood. Incest rumors made that bloodline feel diseased. To accuse him of sexual provocations was to say that he had turned the ruler's body against the moral order. To accuse him of humiliating husbands and wives was to show that no household remained secure beneath his gaze. The private world, which Roman men imagined themselves governing, could be invaded by imperial whim. The sisters matter here, though their story belongs more fully to the next movement of the narrative. Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and Livilla were not minor figures standing at the edge of Caligula's life. They were dynastic women, descendants of sacred bloodlines in Roman political imagination. Their closeness to him could be read as family loyalty, political partnership, emotional dependence, or something more scandalous. And ancient writers often chose the darkest reading. This is one reason the evidence becomes so difficult. In a dynasty with few safe people, intense sibling closeness may have had political and emotional explanations. Caligula had seen members of his family destroyed under Tiberius. Trust inside the imperial house was rare, elevating his sisters, honoring them unusually, binding them visibly to his rule. These choices could reflect affection, dynastic strategy, or defiance of old norms. Later rumor turned that closeness into sexual accusation. The legend may have grown larger than the event itself, but again, the legend had work to do. It made Caligula intelligible as a tyrant. Roman political thought had long associated tyranny with the collapse of boundaries. A tyrant did not respect law, rank, kinship, modesty, or the difference between public and private. He consumed everything. So the more Caligula was painted as a tyrant, the more natural it became for writers to imagine him violating the most sacred limits of family and status. This does not make him innocent. It makes the picture more complicated. Caligula's reign did end in violence. His behavior did alarm powerful people. His relationship with the elite appears to have deteriorated badly. He was assassinated after only a few years in power, and assassination is never a sign of a healthy political settlement. Something about his rule became intolerable to those close enough to strike. But the sexual stories are not a clean record of that collapse. They are the moral vocabulary of the collapse. They tell us how Romans translated political fear into bodily accusation. They show us what kind of ruler they thought deserved death. Not only one who killed, taxed, or insulted, but one who made the world feel upside down. A ruler who turned the palace into a theater and forced Rome's nobility to perform in it. A ruler whose desire, whether real or imagined, seemed to erase every boundary that made Roman order recognizable. In that sense, Caligula marks a turning point. With Augustus, the imperial family had been staged as respectable. With Tiberius, it became hidden and suspicious. With Caligula, at least in the tradition that survived, the hidden became theatrical. The emperor's private life did not merely leak into politics. It was said to stride into the room, smile, and make everyone else understand that shame now belonged to the powerless. That is the chill beneath the scandal. Not that Rome discovered an emperor could be immoral. Rome had never been that innocent. The deeper fear was that an emperor could make immorality sovereign, that he could take the acts most associated with secrecy, vulnerability, and family honor and turn them into demonstrations of rule. Caligula's desire, as remembered by his enemies, was terror because it made power feel impossible to escape. Even the household was no refuge. Even marriage was no shield. Even blood could be turned into rumor. And once the emperor's gaze entered every private space, Rome had to confront the dark possibility that under absolute power there might be no such thing as private life at all. The scandal of Caligula cannot be understood only by looking at Caligula. Around him stood 3 women whose names carried the weight of the dynasty: Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and Livilla. They were his sisters, but in the imperial household, even the word sister was not simple. It meant blood. It meant memory. It meant danger. It meant a possible alliance in a family where trust had become rare, and survival was never guaranteed by innocence. They had been born into the house of Germanicus, one of the most admired figures of the early empire. Germanicus was remembered as charismatic, noble, and beloved by the people and the army. His death left behind not only grief, but a kind of political afterglow. His children inherited that glow. They were not merely private descendants. They were living fragments of a public myth. And myth is useful. When Caligula came to power, his connection to Germanicus helped him appear as a restoration of something warmer and more hopeful than the final years of Tiberius. His sisters were part of that image. By honoring them, he was not only showing family affection, he was displaying this bloodline that made him legitimate. In a dynasty built on adoption, marriage, remarriage, exile, suspicion, and carefully managed succession, blood could become a political argument. This is one reason the sisters mattered so much. Ancient writers describe Caligula giving them extraordinary honors. Their names were included in public formulas. Their position near him was made unusually visible. To Roman eyes, this could look like devotion, arrogance, innovation, or indecency, depending on who was watching and how much they already feared the young emperor. Here we need to slow down, because the most famous accusation is also the most treacherous. Later accounts claim that Caligula had incestuous relationships with his sisters, especially Drusilla. The story became one of the central stains on his reputation. But the evidence is uncertain, and the accusation must remain uncertain. Roman political writing often used sexual transgression as a way to describe political transgression. To say that an emperor violated the boundaries of family was a powerful way of saying he violated every boundary. That does not mean the rumors appeared from nowhere. Caligula's public closeness to his sisters may have seemed excessive to some contemporaries. His honors for them may have unsettled traditional expectations. Drusilla, in particular, seems to have held a special emotional place in his life. When she died, he reportedly mourned her with extraordinary intensity and had her consecrated as divine. For supporters, this could be framed as grief and dynastic reverence. For critics, it became evidence of something unhealthy, theatrical, and dangerous. The same act can change meaning depending on who writes it down. That is one of the quiet rules of imperial history. A brother mourns his sister, and the story may be tender. An emperor mourns his sister, and the story becomes political. If he mourns too little, he is cold. If he mourns too much, he is unstable. If he honors her publicly, he is pious. If he honors her beyond custom, he is monstrous. The imperial family lived inside an interpretive trap. Every gesture had too many witnesses, and every witness had a theory. Drusilla became the center of the darkest legend, because she seems to have been the sister Caligula loved most openly. But Agrippina the Younger is the sister whose future casts the longest shadow. Agrippina was not merely a woman caught inside scandal. She was a political survivor of remarkable force. Later, she would marry Claudius, maneuver her son Nero toward the throne, and become one of the most formidable figures in Roman imperial history. But under Caligula, she was still one of the emperor's sisters, standing close enough to power to benefit from it, and close enough to be endangered by it. Her presence reminds us that the women of the imperial house were not just ornaments in men's stories. They were symbols, yes, and often treated unfairly by the sources. But they were also actors in a system where marriage, motherhood, proximity, and ancestry could move the machinery of state. A woman did not need to command a legion to alter succession. She needed a son, a husband, a name, a claim, access, timing, and the ability to survive. Livilla, the third sister, is more easily overshadowed, but that too is revealing. Imperial women often appear in the record most clearly when they become useful to accusation. Their interior lives are mostly lost. We see them when they marry, when they are exiled, when they are accused, when they give birth, when they threaten a line of succession, or when a historian needs a moral example. The person disappears behind the function. With Caligula's sisters, the function was enormous. They represented the intimacy of dynasty. They stood at the point where family affection and political legitimacy touched. If Caligula elevated them, he elevated his own bloodline. If rumor sexualized that closeness, then the same bloodline could be made to look corrupted. The empire's legitimacy and the empire's shame could be built from the same family portrait. This is why incest rumors were so powerful in Roman political imagination. Incest was not only a sexual accusation, it was an accusation against order itself. Roman society depended on categories: father, daughter, husband, wife, brother, sister, citizen, slave, senator, emperor. The categories were not always humane, but they were deeply meaningful. To accuse a ruler of collapsing the family categories was to suggest that he might collapse every other category too. The rumor said, if he does not respect blood, why would he respect law? Again, that is an argument, not proof. But it was an argument Roman audiences could understand. Caligula's treatment of his sisters also reveals a tension inside monarchy. A republic can distribute honor across many families, offices, and traditions. A monarchy concentrates honor around one household. That concentration makes the royal or imperial family shine more brightly, but it also makes every relationship inside it suspicious. Sibling affection becomes faction. Marriage becomes strategy. Motherhood becomes a political office without a title. Grief becomes propaganda. A sister is never just a sister. In a more ordinary family, closeness might remain human. In the house of Caesar, it became evidence. What makes the story especially unsettling is how little room these women had to exist outside male interpretation. Drusilla is remembered largely through Caligula's grief and the rumors attached to it. Livilla appears through the turbulence surrounding her brother's rule. Agrippina survives more vividly because she later seized a larger role. But even then, ancient writers often frame her ambition as unnatural, dangerous, almost masculine in the threatening sense they wish to condemn. Modern readers should be careful not to inherit that judgment too easily. Ambition in imperial women was not an optional vanity. It could be a survival strategy. The palace did not reward passivity with safety. Women who stood near succession were too valuable to ignore and too dangerous to leave alone. They were married, divorced, honored, exiled, recalled, praised, and blamed according to political needs that often had little to do with their private wishes. The sisters of Caligula lived inside that pressure. Their brother's reign made them visible. His honors raised them above customary expectations. His enemies then used that visibility to darken the entire household. Whether or not the worst rumors were true, the effect was lasting. The Julian-Claudian family began to look, in Roman memory, less like a sacred line descending from Augustus, and more like a closed chamber where blood had become too concentrated, too powerful, too dangerous. That fear would not end with Caligula. Agrippina would carry it forward. She would step from the role of sister into the roles of wife, mother, strategist, and kingmaker. The rumors surrounding her brother would become part of the atmosphere in which her own power was judged. When Rome later looked at her, it would not see only a woman of ambition. It would see the daughter of Germanicus, the sister of Caligula, the wife of Claudius, the mother of Nero, a living intersection of every hope and every nightmare the dynasty had produced. For now, though, the image is still the young emperor and his sisters, standing too close to the center of power. Maybe there was affection there, maybe calculation, maybe grief, maybe behavior that startled even a society accustomed to elite excess. The sources do not allow us to separate those threads cleanly, but the scandal endured because it gave Rome a language for something it already feared. That imperial power had turned the family inward upon itself, until love, blood, ambition, and suspicion could no longer be told apart. Claudius came to power almost by accident, at least in the way Roman memory liked to tell it. After Caligula was assassinated, the palace fell into panic. Soldiers moved through rooms that had just become dangerous. The imperial family, already thinned by suspicion and bloodshed, suddenly faced a question Rome could never escape for long. Who now had the right to rule? In that confusion, Claudius emerged from the margins of his own dynasty. He was not the man many would have chosen if the empire had calmly opened a list of candidates. Ancient writers often describe him through his body, his awkwardness, his speech, his perceived weaknesses. Some of these descriptions may preserve real impressions. Others are colored by aristocratic contempt. Claudius had spent much of his life underestimated, which may have helped him survive. A man overlooked in the palace could sometimes outlive the brilliant. And then, unexpectedly, he became emperor. His reign would prove more capable than his enemies wanted to admit. Claudius took administration seriously. He expanded the machinery of government. He paid attention to legal business. He could be scholarly, diligent, and stubborn, yet his reputation never fully escaped the image of a ruler controlled by those around him. Wives, freedmen, advisors, people who stood near the imperial ear and therefore near the empire's bloodstream. That image is essential to the scandal of Messalina. Valeria Messalina, Claudius's wife, became one of the most notorious women in Roman history. The ancient tradition surrounds her with accusations of sexual excess, manipulation, cruelty, and reckless appetite. Her name became almost a shorthand for imperial shamelessness, but we have to approach that reputation carefully. Messalina was written about by men who already had a vocabulary for dangerous women, and they used it freely. A politically active imperial wife could be turned very quickly into a sexual monster on the page. Still, behind the exaggeration, there was a real crisis. Messalina was not simply accused of private adultery. The danger was that her relationships could create political alternatives. In an ordinary moral scandal, a husband is humiliated, a household dishonored, a lineage questioned. In the imperial house, the stakes multiplied. A lover might become a faction. A child's legitimacy might be whispered about. A nobleman close to the empress might begin to look like a future claimant, or at least a man around whom dissatisfied forces could gather. This is why Messalina's story became so explosive. The most dramatic episode involves Gaius Silius, a senator described as handsome, high-born, and politically significant. According to ancient accounts, Messalina entered into a relationship with him and, in an astonishing escalation, went through a form of marriage with him while Claudius was still alive. Whether every detail happened exactly as later writers present, it remains debated, but the core scandal was remembered as a direct challenge to imperial order. A wife's affair was one thing. An empress's alleged marriage to another man was something close to political theater with a blade hidden in the costume. If the story is true in its strongest form, it was wildly reckless. If it was distorted by hostile reporting, it still reveals the fear surrounding Messalina's position. The idea that Claudius's wife could publicly or semi-publicly bind herself to another aristocratic man suggested more than sexual betrayal. It suggested that the emperor's household had been breached. It raised the possibility that someone else could stand beside the empress and, through her, reach toward the center of power. The ancient sources often make Claudius look foolish in this episode, almost absurdly unaware until others force him to see the danger. That portrayal served a purpose. It reinforced the larger judgment that Claudius, however diligent, lacked mastery over his own home. And in Roman political morality, that weakness was not domestic. It was imperial. The question beneath the scandal was brutal. If Claudius could not control Messalina, who was controlling Rome? This may sound unfair, and it was. Roman men often blamed women for the instability created by the system itself. The imperial household concentrated access so intensely that anyone near the emperor became suspect. Wives were expected to support the dynasty, produce heirs, embody virtue, and remain politically useful without appearing politically powerful. It was an impossible balance, too passive, and they disappeared, too visible, and they became threats. Messalina's reputation formed inside that impossible space. She may indeed have acted dangerously. She may have built networks of influence. She may have pursued desire with little caution. But the surviving portrait is so intensely moralized that it is hard to separate woman from warning. Ancient writers do not merely accuse her. They arrange her life like a lesson. She becomes the empress whose appetite shamed Rome, the wife whose lack of restraint exposed the emperor's weakness, the woman whose bedchamber turned into a rival court. And yet, the deeper issue was not desire alone. It was succession. Claudius had children. The future of the dynasty depended on their protection, legitimacy, and political positioning. Messalina, as mother and empress, stood close to that future. Any man attached to her could be imagined as a threat to it. Any scandal around her could disturb the delicate arrangement of inheritance. When the imperial line is uncertain, sexuality becomes evidence, and evidence becomes danger. The alleged marriage to Silius, therefore, was remembered not simply because it was shocking, but because it seemed to rearrange the map of power without permission. Imagine Rome trying to process it, the emperor alive, his wife linked to another man, ritual, rumor, ambition, and disbelief collapsing into one another. Was it a love affair? A conspiracy? A symbolic act? A reckless fantasy? A distorted account of something less formal? The sources leave room for caution, but the political outcome leaves little doubt. Messalina was destroyed. Claudius, once made aware or convinced of the threat, acted. Messalina was executed. Silius and others associated with the scandal also fell. The palace absorbed the shock, and then did what imperial palaces do. It rearranged itself around the survivor. But the stain remained. For later writers, Messalina's fall became proof of everything they wanted to say about Claudius's reign. The emperor was learned but blind. The wife was beautiful but corrupt. The palace was busy but rotten. Freedmen and women whispered while the ruler signed documents. It is a vivid picture, perhaps too vivid to be innocent. This is where the storyteller's instinct and the historian's caution must sit together uneasily. Messalina's scandal cannot be dismissed as pure invention, because something serious clearly happened. But the version that survived has been polished into moral theater. Every element is arranged for maximum humiliation. The foolish husband, the shameless wife, the daring lover, the delayed revelation, the sudden punishment. It feels almost dramatic because ancient historians knew how to make politics dramatic, and because Rome wanted this drama to mean something. Messalina's story warned that an emperor's weakness could open the door to private capture of public power. It warned that female sexuality, when imagined as uncontrolled, could threaten lineage and state. It warned that proximity to the emperor was more dangerous than office, because official power could be seen, while bedroom influence could not. But perhaps the story also warns us about Rome itself. A political system that depends so heavily on one household will eventually turn household failures into constitutional emergencies. A wife's betrayal becomes a crisis of government. A rumor becomes a matter of security. A marriage, real or alleged, becomes an attempted revolution. The system makes private conduct carry too much weight, and then condemns the people crushed beneath that weight for being scandalous. Claudius survived Messalina, but he did not escape the pattern she revealed. After her death, he would marry again. This time, the woman beside him would not be remembered as merely reckless or indulgent. She would be remembered as colder, sharper, more strategic. A woman who understood that in the imperial palace, marriage was not the opposite of power. It was one of power's most effective forms. Her name was Agrippina. Agrippina the Younger did not enter history softly. By the time she married Claudius, she had already survived a kind of education that few people in Rome could have endured without becoming either cautious to the point of invisibility or ambitious to the point of danger. She was the daughter of Germanicus, the sister of Caligula, a woman exiled, recalled, watched, judged, and carried forward by a name that was both protection and threat. In another family, ancestry might be comfort. In the imperial house, ancestry was a target painted in gold. Agrippina understood the palace not as a home, but as a landscape of openings and traps. A door left unguarded could become an opportunity. A marriage could become a ladder. A child could become a claim. A rumor could become a sentence. The lesson of earlier reigns was plain enough. Power did not always belong to the person with the title. It often belonged to the person who could shape access to the title, who could stand close enough to succession to bend it. That is what made her marriage to Claudius so consequential. After Messalina's fall, Claudius needed more than a wife. He needed the household repaired. He needed legitimacy after humiliation. He needed a woman whose name could stabilize the dynasty rather than embarrass it. Agrippina offered something no ordinary aristocratic bride could offer: Julian blood, public prestige, and a son. That son was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the boy who would become Nero. Here, marriage becomes less a romantic arrangement than a constitutional instrument. Agrippina's union with Claudius brought her directly into the center of imperial authority. But her greater achievement was not simply becoming empress. It was making her son imaginable as the future. This required more than maternal hope. It required strategy. Claudius already had a biological son, Britannicus, born to Messalina. In a simpler world, Britannicus might have stood naturally in the line of succession. But Rome's imperial system was rarely simple. Age mattered. Public visibility mattered. Adoption mattered. The memory of Augustus mattered. The ability to present continuity mattered. Agrippina's task was to make Nero look not like an outsider brought forward by maternal ambition, but like the safest extension of the dynasty. Adoption was the key. When Claudius adopted Agrippina's son, Lucius Domitius became Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. A new name did not merely decorate him, it repositioned him. In Roman elite culture, adoption could be a powerful legal and political act, capable of transferring identity, inheritance, and expectation. Augustus himself had built succession through adoption and family arrangement. Agrippina was not inventing the rules. She was using the rules with unusual precision. And this is where her reputation becomes difficult to untangle. Ancient writers often portray Agrippina as ruthless, domineering, almost unnaturally ambitious. They do not simply say she pursued power. They make her hunger for it feel like a violation of womanhood itself. The tone matters. Roman authors could admire determination in a man while treating the same quality in a woman as a symptom of disorder. Agrippina's intelligence was remembered as menace. Her political skill became manipulation. Her motherhood became a kind of invasion. But we should be careful. Agrippina did operate aggressively within the structures available to her. She advanced Nero. She cultivated influence. She appeared publicly in ways that could unsettle Roman expectations. She understood the symbolic value of image, title, ceremony, and proximity. Yet none of this requires us to turn her into a melodrama villain. The palace rewarded calculation because the palace punished weakness. Agrippina played a dangerous game in a system designed by men, then was condemned by men for playing it too well. That does not make her innocent. It makes her Roman. Her marriage to Claudius also reveals how female power worked when formal office was mostly closed to women. Agrippina did not need a magistracy to matter. Her authority moved through kinship. Wife of the emperor, mother of the adopted heir, descendant of Germanicus, sister of a former emperor. These were not ceremonial labels, they were political technologies. She could shape who entered the imperial circle. She could influence how Nero was seen. She could gather loyalists around the future rather than the present. She could make her son's advancement seem like destiny rather than intrusion. In a monarchy that pretended to be something else, the family was the machinery behind the mask, and Agrippina knew where the gears were hidden. The most important move was not one dramatic gesture, but a steady rearrangement of expectation. Nero was married into Claudius's line through Octavia, Claudius's daughter. He was given prominence. He was presented to the public. Honors gathered around him. Britannicus, meanwhile, remained younger and increasingly vulnerable to being overshadowed. None of this had to be announced as a coup. That was the elegance of it. Succession could be redirected not by storming the palace, but by changing what everyone assumed would happen next. Power often works that way, not as thunder, as weather. By the time Claudius died, Nero was close enough to the throne to step into it. Ancient accounts accuse Agrippina of involvement in Claudius's death, often through the famous story of poisoned mushrooms, but this remains disputed and should be treated with caution. What matters for this part of the story is not whether every dark detail can be proven. It is that many Romans found the accusation believable because Agrippina had so clearly benefited from the arrangement of events. Suspicion followed success. That is one of the oldest rules of court politics. The more perfectly a sequence serves someone's interest, the more tempting it becomes to imagine their hand behind every link in the chain. Agrippina's rise was so effective that later writers could look backward and turn strategy into conspiracy, influence into poison, motherhood into predation. Perhaps some of the darker suspicions contained truth. Perhaps some grew from the discomfort of seeing a woman direct the future of Rome with such visible force. Either way, the result was undeniable. Agrippina placed Nero in the line of succession and helped carry him to the throne. For a brief moment, she seemed to stand almost beside imperial power, not behind it. Coins, honors, and public imagery suggested a mother whose role could not be politely hidden. She had not merely given birth to an emperor. She had manufactured one. But manufacturing an emperor is not the same as controlling him. This is the quiet flaw in Agrippina's victory. A son can be advanced through maternal ambition, but once he becomes emperor, the relationship changes. The boy who owed his power to his mother would soon discover that dependence is humiliating when dressed in purple. Gratitude can decay quickly in a palace, especially when every advisor, rival, and observer understands that the mother is too powerful to remain harmless. Agrippina's marriage to Claudius had been a weapon, and it struck its target with extraordinary accuracy. It gave her rank. It gave Nero a new father. It gave him a new name. It brought him closer to Octavia, closer to legitimacy, closer to the soldiers and officials who would matter when the moment came. It repaired the imperial household after Messalina by replacing scandalous appetite, at least in public image, with disciplined dynastic purpose. But weapons do not vanish after they are used. They remain in the room. And once Nero became emperor, Agrippina herself became the dangerous object left behind. The mother who knew too much, had done too much, and could remind the ruler of the one truth no emperor wanted spoken aloud: that his power had first passed through someone else's hands. Chapter 9. Nero's First Love and the Mother He Could Not Escape. Nero became emperor at an age when most young men are still learning how to disguise uncertainty. He was not born to the throne in a straight line. He had been moved toward it, step by step, by adoption, marriage, ceremony, and the relentless will of Agrippina the Younger. By the time Rome saluted him as princeps, the story had already been arranged around him. He was the chosen heir, the new hope, the young ruler who might soften the memory of Claudius's final years and carry the dynasty forward with grace. But inside that polished public image was a more uncomfortable truth. Nero's power had a mother's fingerprints all over it. Agrippina had not merely raised him, she had engineered him. She had married Claudius, secured Nero's adoption, advanced his public status, and helped place him above Britannicus, the emperor's own son. Whatever Nero felt toward her, gratitude, fear, resentment, dependence, affection, none of it could remain private. Their relationship was now part of the architecture of the state. This is a strange kind of inheritance. To receive the world, and with it, the constant reminder that someone else helped put it in your hands. At first, Agrippina's influence was visible. Too visible, perhaps. She occupied a position that made many Romans uneasy, not because imperial mothers had never mattered before, but because Agrippina seemed unwilling to disappear into the background. She had the prestige of birth, the authority of motherhood, and the confidence of someone who had survived enough danger to believe caution was for other people. Nero, meanwhile, was expected to become a man in the most public way possible. Roman masculinity, especially at the imperial level, was not just biological adulthood. It was command, self-mastery, independence, the ability to govern others without appearing governed. A young emperor could accept advice, but he could not appear owned by it. And advice from a mother was especially delicate. It could be framed as care, but also as domination. It could look like wisdom or like humiliation. The palace must have been full of watching eyes. Every audience, every ceremonial appearance, every small sign of deference between mother and son could become a political reading. Was Agrippina guiding him? Was Nero resisting? Who had access? Who was being excluded? Who spoke first? Who stood too close? In this atmosphere, family affection became almost impossible to preserve. Nero's early marriage to Octavia deepened the trap. Octavia was Claudius's daughter, and her marriage to Nero had helped bind him to the imperial line. She was not simply a young wife. She was legitimacy made human. Through her, Nero's claim looked less like the triumph of Agrippina's ambition and more like continuity with Claudius's house. But marriages designed for legitimacy are rarely designed for tenderness. Octavia's position was painful because her value was political before it was personal. She connected Nero to the dynasty. She represented the arrangement that had made him emperor. She also reminded everyone of Britannicus, of Messalina, of Claudius, of the line that Nero had effectively stepped over. To keep Octavia was to honor the logic that had secured his throne. To reject her would risk exposing how fragile that logic had always been. So Nero began his reign surrounded by women who represented different forms of power over him. Agrippina, the mother who made him emperor. Octavia, the wife who helped justify him. Neither relationship could be reduced to emotion. Both carried the weight of succession. Both tied Nero to obligations he may have experienced less as support than as constraint. And for a young ruler hungry for his own identity, constraint can begin to feel like insult. This is where the story becomes more psychological, though we have to be careful not to pretend we can fully enter Nero's mind. Ancient historians describe tensions between Nero and Agrippina, and the broad outline is plausible. As Nero grew more confident, he wanted freedom from maternal control. Advisors around him had reasons to reduce Agrippina's power. Agrippina had reasons to remind him who had made him. The conflict did not need melodrama to become dangerous. The structure itself produced it. A mother who creates an emperor creates a rival. That is the brutal logic of the palace. For Agrippina, influence over Nero was not merely vanity, it was protection. If she lost her hold over him, she lost the shield her own ambition had built. Too many people had been harmed by her rise. Too many resented her. Too many understood that once Nero no longer needed her, her position could become precarious. In ordinary life, a son's independence is natural. In imperial life, it could be a death sentence. For Nero, Agrippina's influence became a living contradiction. He owed her everything, and that debt made him less sovereign. The more she had done for him, the more intolerable her presence could become. Gratitude is a noble emotion when freely held. When it is enforced by memory, witnesses, and political dependence, it can sour into rage. Octavia's marriage was quieter, but no less suffocating. She was young, dignified in the hostile tradition, and later remembered with sympathy. But in Nero's emotional world, she may have represented a script written by others. She was the proper wife, the dynastic wife, the Claudian wife. She belonged to the public version of Nero, the princeps shaped by adoption, guided by advisors, bound by family expectation. If Nero wanted to become something else, artist, lover, performer, liberated ruler, Octavia stood as a reminder that Rome had already decided what he should be. This does not excuse what would happen to her. It helps explain why her existence became politically inconvenient. The early years of Nero's reign were not immediately the descent into theatrical ruin that later memory preferred. There was administrative competence around him. There were experienced advisors. The regime had moments of stability. But beneath that surface, the central domestic conflict was already forming. Nero's desire to possess his own power against the people whose presence proved that power was inherited, arranged, and supervised. The old Roman anxiety returns here in a new form. Can a man rule the empire if he cannot rule his own household? But in Nero's case, the question has a darker reversal. Can a young emperor ever truly rule his household when his household is the reason he rules at all? Agrippina could not simply become an ordinary mother. Octavia could not simply become an ordinary wife. The palace did not allow such mercy. It turned relationships into offices and emotions into evidence. A quarrel with a mother became a constitutional crisis. A loveless marriage became a question of legitimacy. A lover outside the marriage could become a threat to the line of succession. Nero's first struggle, then, was not against the Senate, or the army, or a foreign enemy. It was against the web of intimacy that had crowned him. He had been placed inside a carefully constructed dynastic machine, and the machine had worked. But now it expected him to remain where it had positioned him. Agrippina expected influence. Octavia expected recognition. The public expected respectability. The dynasty expected continuity. Rome expected the young emperor's private life to confirm the legitimacy of his public role. Nero would spend the rest of his reign resisting that expectation, and in the struggle to free himself from the women who symbolized his obligations, he would discover a terrible freedom, the freedom of an emperor who could remove the people who reminded him of his debts. Poppaea Sabina enters Nero's story like a change in temperature. With Agrippina, power had the face of a mother. With Octavia, it wore the mask of legitimacy. Poppaea offered something different. Not the old machinery that had placed Nero on the throne, but the possibility of escape from it. She belonged to the world Nero wanted to choose for himself, or at least the world he wanted to believe he had chosen. That distinction matters. Imperial love was rarely innocent, not because no one in the palace could feel genuine desire, but because desire near the throne never traveled alone. It brought ambition with it. It brought calculation, faction, resentment, and opportunity. A woman loved by the emperor could become a political force whether she sought it or not. A woman who knew how to survive that attention could become something far more dangerous. Poppaea was remembered by ancient writers as beautiful, refined, alluring, and ambitious. Those descriptions may tell us as much about Roman suspicion as about Poppaea herself. When a woman gained influence over an emperor, historians often reached for the same tools. Beauty became strategy, charm became manipulation, intimacy became conspiracy. But the broad fact remains. Nero's attachment to Poppaea changed the balance of the palace. She was not simply another lover. She became an alternative future. To understand why, we have to return to Octavia. Nero's marriage to her had been politically useful, but emotionally dead in the surviving tradition. Octavia linked him to Claudius. She represented duty, dynastic continuity, and the arranged respectability that had helped secure his accession. For Rome, she was a stabilizing figure. For Nero, she may have become a reminder of everything he had not chosen. The mother's plan, the adoptive father's line, the court's expectations, the quiet discipline of imperial appearances. Poppaea, by contrast, seemed to belong to desire and self-invention. That is why the relationship was so threatening. An emperor's mistress was not automatically a crisis. Roman political life had room for hypocrisy. But when the mistress began to displace the wife, when desire began to challenge legitimacy, the old anxieties awakened. Was Nero ruling as a disciplined princeps, or as a young man remaking the state around his appetites? Was Poppaea merely loved, or was she influencing decisions that should belong to Rome? Was Octavia being rejected as a woman, or was the Claudian connection being erased? In the palace, these questions could not be separated. Poppaea's rise also unfolded in the shadow of Agrippina. Ancient accounts often suggest that Agrippina opposed Nero's new attachments when they threatened her control, and that Poppaea encouraged Nero to free himself from his mother's influence. The precise details are difficult to verify, and the sources have every reason to dramatize female rivalry. But the political logic is clear enough. Agrippina's power depended on Nero remaining tied to the old arrangement. Poppaea's future depended on Nero breaking from it. Between mother, wife, and lover, Nero's private life became a contest over the meaning of his reign. This is where the story can easily become too simple. It is tempting to imagine Poppaea as the seductress who whispered destruction into Nero's ear. Agrippina as the devouring mother, Octavia as the innocent victim, and Nero as the weak young emperor pulled from one woman to another. Ancient writers often encourage that kind of reading. It is vivid. It is moral. It gives the audience recognizable roles. But history is rarely that tidy. Nero was not a passive object being carried by stronger women. He had his own desires, resentments, vanity, and hunger for independence. Poppaea may have benefited from his choices, but the choices were not hers alone. To blame the women around Nero for Nero's violence would repeat one of the oldest evasions in Roman moral writing. The emperor had power. The emperor signed the fate of others. The emperor's love could become fatal because he was emperor, not because women made him helpless. Poppaea's significance lies less in the cliché of seduction than in the way she helped Nero imagine a different center of loyalty. With her, Nero could step away from the cold architecture of dynastic marriage and towards something that felt personal. But what feels personal to an emperor can become public catastrophe. A private preference could rearrange court alliances. A romantic rejection could become exile. A new wife could require the removal of an old one. A pregnancy could change the future of succession. The emotional logic of one man could become the political fate of many. Octavia's fall shows the cost. Nero eventually divorced Octavia. The reasons given were politically and morally framed, as such reasons had to be, but the deeper movement was unmistakable. The emperor was clearing space for Poppaea. Octavia was not merely set aside. She became dangerous because she remained beloved, or at least respected by many. Her very innocence, or the public perception of it, made her a reproach. A discarded wife with dynastic blood could become a symbol around which discontent gathered. So the machinery of accusation began to move. Octavia was charged, disgraced, exiled, and eventually killed. The details in ancient sources are grim and shaped by moral outrage, but the essential point is not hard to see. Nero's desire for a new life with Poppaea required the destruction of the woman who embodied the old one. Love did not simply replace legitimacy, it had to eliminate it. This is one of the cruelest patterns in imperial history. The palace rarely allowed rivals to remain symbolic. A person did not need an army to be threatening. A name could be enough. A memory could be enough. A crowd's sympathy could be enough. Octavia, alive and wronged, represented a version of Rome that Nero wanted to move beyond, but could not safely ignore. Poppaea then rose into the place Octavia had occupied. As Nero's wife, she offered the possibility of a new dynastic image. If she bore children, she could transform from lover into mother of the future. That transition mattered enormously. Roman suspicion of mistresses could soften when fertility entered the picture, or at least change its language. A woman who produced an heir was no longer only a private indulgence. She became a vessel of continuity, which is a cold phrase, but an accurate one for how dynastic politics often treated women. Yet Poppaea's position remained morally unstable in the tradition. To those hostile to Nero, she could never fully escape the stain of how she rose. Octavia's absence haunted her. Agrippina's death haunted the palace. The sequence of removals around Nero made every intimacy look predatory. Even if Poppaea loved him, even if Nero loved her, even if their marriage contained moments of ordinary tenderness now lost to us, history remembered the political trail behind them. That is the sadness of these imperial relationships. The human elements are almost always swallowed by consequence. Perhaps Nero did feel real passion for Poppaea. Perhaps she saw in him not only a ruler to be managed, but a man capable of fascination, generosity, insecurity, and theatrical charm. We should leave room for the possibility that ancient people were as emotionally complicated as we are. But whatever affection existed was trapped inside a system where affection could not remain small. When Nero loved, people measured succession. When Nero desired, advisors recalculated. When Nero chose, rivals vanished. Poppaea's seduction of power, then, was not simply that she seduced Nero. It was that power itself seduced everyone near it into believing that private happiness could be secured by political removal. Remove the mother, and the son will be free. Remove the wife, and the lover can become legitimate. Remove the rival memory, and the future can begin cleanly. But imperial history has little patience for clean beginnings. Every removal leaves a mark. Every erased rival becomes part of the story. Octavia's fall did not purify Nero's new marriage. It made that marriage stand on visible wreckage. Poppaea's rise did not free Nero from the politics of intimacy. It deepened them. The bedroom did not become more private once love had triumphed. It became more crowded than ever, filled with the dead, the exiled, the suspicious, and the watching eyes of Rome. And somewhere in that crowded silence, Nero's reign crossed another threshold. The emperor had learned that love could justify rupture, that desire could demand sacrifices, that the people closest to him could be reclassified as obstacles. Poppaea may have seemed like liberation, but the path toward her had taught Nero a darker lesson. In the palace, affection and elimination could become parts of the same sentence. By the time Poppaea stood beside Nero, the palace had already learned to speak in absences. Agrippina was gone. Octavia was gone. Britannicus, too, had vanished from the living field of succession. Each death had its own circumstances, its own ancient accounts, its own layer of accusation and uncertainty. But together they formed something more chilling than any single event. They created the impression of a ruler whose private life had become surrounded by removal. That is the word to hold for a moment. Removal. Not always in the crude sense of immediate violence, though violence was certainly there. Removal could mean exile, legal disgrace, forced silence, a reputation destroyed before the body fell, a person pushed from the center to the edge, then from the edge into danger, then from danger into memory. In Nero's world, the people who embodied unwanted obligations did not simply lose arguments. They disappeared from the future. Agrippina's death was the most psychologically charged of all. The mother who had made Nero emperor became the woman he could not endure. Ancient accounts describe a relationship that deteriorated into fear, resentment, and plots. The famous story of her murder contains almost theatrical elements: failed schemes, a staged accident, survival, panic, and finally, direct killing. Some details may have been shaped for dramatic effect, but the central fact is not seriously in doubt. Nero had his mother killed. That act changed everything. Romans were familiar with political murder. Their history was not gentle, but matricide carried a special horror. To kill a rival was one thing. To kill the mother who gave you life, and in Nero's case, the mother who helped give you empire, was a violation that seemed to tear through nature itself. It gave Nero's enemies the perfect symbol. If he could destroy Agrippina, what boundary remained? And yet, to reduce Agrippina's death to personal cruelty alone would miss the structure around it. She was not only his mother, she was a political force, a living archive of how he had come to power. Her presence made his independence incomplete. As long as she lived, she could remind Nero and everyone else that the emperor had once been a project managed by someone stronger. In the palace, memory can be dangerous. Nero's conflict with Agrippina was therefore both intimate and constitutional. A son wanted freedom from a mother. An emperor wanted freedom from a maker. Advisors may have encouraged the break. Rivals may have feared her influence. Agrippina herself may have maneuvered aggressively to preserve her position. The result was a murder that looked private and political at the same time, which is exactly why it became so unforgettable. Octavia's death belonged to a different emotional register, but it deepened the pattern. She was not dangerous because she commanded armies or dazzled the court with ambition. She was dangerous because she represented legitimacy. As Claudius's daughter and Nero's wife, she stood for the respectable version of Nero's rule, the version tied to adoption, dynastic continuity, and public expectation. Once Nero chose Poppaea, Octavia became a problem not by acting, but by existing. That kind of danger is especially cruel. A person can defend herself against an accusation, perhaps. She can answer a charge, deny a rumor, appeal to loyalty. But how does she defend herself against what she symbolizes? Octavia's innocence, or at least her reputation for innocence, made her more threatening after Nero rejected her. Public sympathy could gather around a wronged imperial woman even if she did nothing to summon it. Her quietness became eloquent. Her suffering became political. So accusation was brought in to do what accusation often does in imperial history: turn a victim into a necessity. Octavia was divorced, exiled, accused, and executed. Ancient sources remember her end with pity and outrage, and even if their details are shaped for moral effect, the broad injustice of the sequence is difficult to avoid. Nero's marriage to Poppaea required space. Octavia occupied that space. The palace solved the problem with the ruthless logic of regimes that fear symbols. Poppaea's own death is harder to handle because the story is famous, dramatic, and uncertain. According to ancient source testimony, Nero killed Poppaea while she was pregnant by kicking her in a fit of anger. This claim remains debated and should be marked uncertain. It may preserve a real tradition of domestic violence at the imperial court. It may also reflect the ancient habit of turning a hated emperor's emotional excess into a physically vivid accusation. We cannot treat the most sensational version as clean fact. What we can say is that Poppaea died while still central to Nero's life and dynastic hopes. Her death deprived him of a wife who had become part of his chosen identity, and if she was pregnant, it also touched the future of succession. Ancient writers often present Nero's grief afterward as intense, even extravagant. That detail, whether sincere or stylized, complicates the portrait. Nero could be capable of attachment and destruction in the same relationship. But then, power often allows contradictions to survive longer than ordinary morality can bear. The deaths around Nero's bedchamber show a ruler whose intimate world had become lethal, but not in a simple, tidy sequence of villainy. Agrippina died because maternal power had become intolerable. Octavia died because legitimate memory had become inconvenient. Poppaea died under circumstances that remain disputed, but her death was absorbed into the larger story of Nero as a man whose passions could not be safely contained. Together, these women became a map of Nero's transformation: the mother, the wife, the beloved. Origin, duty, desire. Each one touched a different part of his identity. Each one, in a different way, became entangled with the question of whether Nero could rule himself. That question mattered deeply to Romans. Self-command was not a decorative virtue. It was the moral foundation of authority. A man who ruled others while being ruled by anger, lust, fear, vanity, or resentment was not merely flawed. He was politically dangerous. The emperor's inner life mattered because there were so few outer restraints strong enough to stop him. When law bends around one person, that person's character becomes a public institution. This is why the bedroom deaths became more than palace tragedy. They allowed later writers to argue that Nero's rule had failed at the most basic level. He could sing, perform, punish, command, and spend, but he could not govern the emotional violence at the center of his life. The women nearest him did not simply quarrel with him or disappoint him. They became threats to be removed, memories to be erased, bodies around which Rome constructed moral judgment. And yet, the erasure never worked. Agrippina became more powerful in death as the murdered mother. Octavia became more beloved in death as the discarded wife. Poppaea became more ambiguous in death as the beloved woman whose end may have revealed the danger of being loved by Nero at all. This is one of history's quiet punishments. Power can kill people, but it cannot always control what they mean afterward. Nero could remove a mother from the palace, but not from the story of his reign. He could replace a wife, but not erase the pity her fall produced. He could mourn Poppaea, but not prevent her death from being folded into the legend of his instability. The palace after midnight, then, was not only a place of desire. It was a place where memory was made through loss. Every intimate bond carried the possibility of accusation. Every death rearranged the moral furniture of the reign. And around Nero, the room seemed to grow emptier and more crowded at once. Emptier of the living people who had shaped him, crowded with the meanings their absence left behind. By the time later Romans looked back, they did not see isolated domestic disasters. They saw a pattern. They saw an emperor trying to free himself from every relationship that limited him, only to become defined by the violence of that freedom. And in that pattern, Nero's private life stopped being private at all. It became the evidence Rome needed for a verdict it had already begun to write. Nero did not only scandalize Rome by whom he loved. He scandalized Rome by how he appeared to love himself. That may sound like a modern judgment, but for Roman writers, Nero's theatrical life and his intimate life belonged to the same accusation. He sang. He performed. He competed before audiences. He entered spaces where an emperor, in the eyes of many aristocrats, should never have lowered himself. The stage was not neutral ground in Roman elite morality. It carried associations of display, dependence on applause, bodily exposure, and social inferiority. A ruler could sponsor entertainment. He could watch it. He could reward it. But to become the performer was something else. For Rome's old ruling class, this was not merely embarrassing. It suggested inversion. The emperor was supposed to command the gaze of the world, not crave it. He was supposed to judge others, not wait for approval. He was supposed to embody disciplined Roman authority, not blur himself with actors, musicians, and public entertainers whose status remained socially suspect no matter how talented they were. Nero's artistic passions may have been sincere. That is worth saying. The ancient sources are so hostile that they sometimes make sincerity itself look grotesque. It is possible that Nero genuinely loved music, performance, spectacle, and the emotional force of being seen. The problem was not that he lacked feeling. The problem was that an emperor's feelings became compulsory for everyone else. If Nero performed, Rome had to applaud. And applause under power is never innocent. This is where his later relationships become part of the same pattern. Ancient writers tell us about Nero's unions with Sporus and Pythagoras, and they use those relationships to portray him as sexually inverted, theatrical, and unfit to rule. The details are shaped by Roman assumptions that differ sharply from modern categories. We should not force today's language onto the past, nor should we accept ancient mockery as objective description. What matters is how these stories functioned in Roman moral imagination. Sporus was a young male whom Nero reportedly had castrated and then treated as a wife, even appearing with him in public in ways that imitated marriage. The account is disturbing, and while the broad tradition is ancient, its details come through hostile writers who delighted in making Nero seem monstrous. Still, the story endured because it condensed several Roman anxieties at once: sexual domination, gender inversion, theatrical display, and the emperor's power to remake another person's body and status for his own emotional needs. Pythagoras appears in another reported union, in which Nero took the role that Roman writers considered feminine or passive. Again, the point for the sources was not simply that Nero had relationships outside conventional marriage. Roman sexual morality was not identical to later Christian morality or modern respectability. The deeper charge was that Nero had abandoned the position of mastery expected of a Roman man, and especially of a Roman ruler. To Roman elites, masculinity was tied to hierarchy. A man could be condemned not only for desire, but for taking the wrong position within desire. He could be attacked for seeming passive, theatrical, luxurious, ruled by pleasure, or softened by foreign habits. These judgments were often cruel, status-obsessed, and deeply unequal. They tell us less about universal morality than about Roman power language. But they mattered because they gave political criticism a bodily form. Nero's enemies did not merely say, "He ruled badly." They said, in effect, "His body proves he ruled badly." His performances proved he wanted applause more than honor. His costumes proved he preferred display to discipline. His relationships proved he had confused the roles by which Roman order was supposed to make sense. His marriages to men, as the sources frame them, were not remembered as private eccentricities. They were presented as public evidence that the emperor had turned the world upside down. This is why Sporus became such a haunting figure in Nero's legend. The story is not only about Nero's sexuality, it is about replacement. Some ancient accounts suggest that Sporus resembled Poppaea, or that Nero treated him as a substitute after her death. Whether that resemblance was real, exaggerated, or literary embroidery, the idea is revealing. It allowed writers to portray Nero as a man who did not mourn by accepting loss, but by manufacturing an imitation. Even grief became theatrical. Even love became a performance staged over another person's body. There is a cruelty here that should not be hidden beneath analysis. Sporus, whatever else he became in imperial spectacle, was a vulnerable person under the control of the most powerful man in the Roman world. The sources often use him mainly to shame Nero, but we should notice what that does. It turns Sporus into a prop twice over, first in Nero's court, then in Nero's reputation. His own interior life almost vanishes. That vanishing is part of the palace's violence. Pythagoras, too, survives more as accusation than as person. The ancient record preserves the scandal because it served a moral argument. Nero had crossed boundaries. Nero had performed femininity. Nero had mocked marriage. Nero had made imperial dignity ridiculous. But the people drawn into these performances remain blurred, because the writers were less interested in them than in what they could prove about the emperor. And what they wanted to prove was collapse. The collapse of discipline. The collapse of Roman masculinity. The collapse of the boundary between ruler and actor, husband and wife, public ceremony and private indulgence. We should pause over that phrase, collapse of Roman masculinity, because it was not an objective medical diagnosis or a neutral social fact. It was an elite accusation. Roman masculinity was a code of power, and like all codes of power, it was defended most loudly when people feared it was unstable. Nero did not destroy Rome by singing on stage or by violating elite expectations of gendered behavior. But those acts gave his critics a vivid way to say that he had destroyed the image of command. In a monarchy disguised as a republic, image mattered desperately. Augustus had survived by appearing controlled. Tiberius suffered by disappearing. Caligula terrified by performing domination. Nero, in the hostile tradition, did something stranger. He performed need. He needed applause. He needed admiration. He needed chosen loves that freed him from dynastic duty. He needed spectacle to confirm the self that politics could not satisfy. For an emperor, need was dangerous. A ruler who needed the crowd could be manipulated by praise. A ruler who needed performance could turn government into scenery. A ruler who needed love without restraint could make other people pay for his self-invention. Roman writers saw in Nero's stage life the same flaw they saw in his marriages and affairs. He could not remain within the role assigned to him. But perhaps that is also why Nero remains so fascinating. He was not simply a tyrant in the old mold. He was a ruler trapped between absolute power and artistic hunger, between dynastic expectation and personal fantasy, between the Roman demand for masculine command and his own attraction to display, transformation, and applause. None of this redeems him. It does make him more unsettling than a flat villain. He reveals a weakness inside empire itself. When one man's identity becomes a public institution, his private longings can become administrative facts. That is the true scandal beneath the costumes. Nero's stage was never just a stage. His brides were never just companions. His performances were never only artistic indulgence. Everything he did carried the weight of rule because there was no safe distance between the emperor and the empire. If he sang, the state listened. If he married, the state interpreted. If he crossed a boundary, the state felt the boundary tremble. By the end, Roman writers could look at Nero and see the opposite of the ideal princeps. not the sober father of the people, not the disciplined guardian of Roman order, not the man who mastered himself before mastering the world. They saw an actor in imperial purple, waiting for applause while the old language of authority cracked around him. And whether that image is fair in every detail matters less than the fact that it survived. Rome remembered Nero not only as a ruler who abused power, but as a man who made power look undignified. In a culture obsessed with rank, restraint, and masculine command, that may have been one of the most unforgivable scandals of all. The emperors did not leave us their bedrooms. They left monuments, coins, laws, ruins, inscriptions, names carved into public stone. But the intimate scandals, the whispered accusations, the dangerous marriages, the alleged perversions, the scenes behind closed doors, come to us mostly through writers, and those writers were not invisible witnesses. They were men with politics, tastes, grudges, moral assumptions, literary habits, and audiences to satisfy. This does not make them useless. It makes them dangerous. Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio shaped much of what later centuries believed about Caligula, Claudius, Nero, and the early empire. Each wrote in a different style, with different aims, at different distances from the events. Tacitus was severe, compressed, aristocratic, fascinated by the corruption of liberty under emperors. Suetonius loved character, anecdote, bodily detail, scandal, and the telling little episode that made a ruler seem vivid. Dio wrote later still, working through inherited traditions and political interpretation. Together, they did not simply record imperial reputation. They manufactured its afterlife. A modern viewer might imagine history as a courtroom where evidence is weighed and verdicts are reached. Ancient historical writing was not that simple. It could preserve valuable memory, yes. It could draw on documents, speeches, earlier histories, official records, and elite oral tradition. But it was also literature. It cared about character. It arranged events to reveal moral meaning. It used rumor not always as proven fact, but as part of a ruler's public image. This is especially important when the subject is sex. Sexual accusation in Roman writing often carried political meaning beyond the act itself. To accuse a ruler of incest, adultery, passive sexuality, uncontrolled lust, or domination through intimacy was to say that his rule had violated the natural and social order. Desire became a diagnostic tool. The emperor's body was treated as evidence of the emperor's soul, and the emperor's soul as evidence of the empire's condition. That is why the same patterns recur. A bad emperor is excessive. A bad emperor cannot control appetite. A bad emperor humiliates noble families. A bad emperor is ruled by women, or by freedmen, or by actors, or by lovers. A bad emperor turns marriage into mockery. A bad emperor crosses boundaries that respectable Roman men claimed to defend. Once you notice the pattern, the stories become harder to read innocently. Caligula's alleged incest with his sisters may preserve some memory of unusual dynastic honors, intense family closeness, or behavior that shocked contemporaries. But in the hands of hostile tradition, it becomes the perfect image of tyranny. The ruler who respects no boundary, not even blood. Nero's relationships with Sporus and Pythagoras may rest on remembered events, but the way they are told reveals Roman obsession with masculine hierarchy and social shame. Messalina's sexual reputation may reflect a genuine political crisis, but the extravagance of the portrait also belongs to a long tradition of blaming powerful women through the language of appetite. The historian's task is not to drain these stories of meaning. It is to ask what kind of meaning they have. Some details are likely rooted in real events. Claudius did execute Messalina after a serious crisis involving Silius. Nero did have Agrippina killed. Octavia did fall so Nero could marry Poppaea. Caligula did elevate his sisters in unusual ways. Nero's stage performances were remembered too widely to be dismissed as invention. These are not empty legends floating free of history. But the moral coloring matters. Ancient writers rarely describe intimate misconduct as neutral information. They shape it into revelation. A sexual rumor becomes a window into tyranny. A wife's alleged infidelity becomes proof of imperial weakness. A mother's influence becomes a sign that the emperor is not fully a man. A performer's costume becomes evidence that the ruler has betrayed Rome. This is why reading the sources requires a double vision. We must see the possible event, and we must see the literary use of the event. Take Suetonius. His biographies are irresistible because they feel close to the skin. He gives habits, appearances, jokes, omens, bedroom details, strange tastes, small humiliations. He makes emperors feel almost physically present. But that intimacy can be deceptive. A pile of anecdotes may create the illusion of psychological certainty. After enough scandalous details, the reader stops asking how each one is known. The accumulation becomes its own proof. Tacitus works differently. His power lies in suspicion, atmosphere, and moral compression. In his world, fear travels through every room. Words have hidden meanings. Silence can be guilt. Public virtue can conceal private calculation. He is one of the greatest artists of political unease ever to write history. But artistry is not the same as neutrality. His senatorial perspective gives him sharp eyes for tyranny, but also deep hostility toward the imperial system that reduced the old aristocracy to dependence. Dio, writing later, inherits the empire as a long story already full of judgments. He can preserve traditions now lost elsewhere, but he also writes with the distance of someone arranging earlier material into patterns. By his time, Caligula and Nero were not merely former rulers. They were types, examples, warnings. Their names already carried moral gravity. So when these writers speak of desire, we listen, but not with folded hands. We ask, who benefits from this portrayal? What fear does it express? Does the accusation resemble a common trope? Is it supported by political events? Does the story explain too much, too neatly? Does it turn a complicated crisis into a convenient moral lesson? Those questions do not always give us firm answers. Sometimes they only teach us humility. The early empire was a dangerous place for truth. Official records could flatter. Court gossip could distort. Survivors had reasons to lie. Enemies had reasons to exaggerate. Later writers had reasons to organize chaos into narrative justice. The dead could not defend themselves, and the disgraced were often remembered by those who had survived their disgrace. Yet we should not swing too far in the other direction. It would be comforting to dismiss every sexual scandal as propaganda, but that would be too easy. Absolute power really does create opportunities for abuse. Imperial proximity really could turn intimacy into coercion. Women, servants, freedmen, spouses, and young favorites could be drawn into relationships shaped by unequal power. The palace was not merely a fantasy invented by moralists. It was a place where private access and public authority truly met. The difficulty is that Roman writers often understood real abuses through biased categories. They might recognize domination, but describe it as moral pollution. They might recognize female influence, but call it unnatural ambition. They might recognize the danger of imperial desire, but frame it as a collapse of masculinity rather than a problem of unchecked power. Their prejudices do not erase their evidence. Their evidence does not excuse their prejudices. This is the narrow bridge we have to walk. Caligula, Claudius, and Nero became infamous partly because of what they did, partly because of what others feared they might do, and partly because of how later authors needed bad emperors to look. The sexual stories helped make tyranny visible. They translated constitutional anxiety into scenes the reader could feel. The violated marriage, the shamed husband, the domineering mother, the theatrical bridegroom, the emperor who turns the household into a stage. In that sense, the historians were not merely gossiping. They were making an argument about power. Their argument was that absolute rule deforms the ruler's private life, and that the deformed private life reveals the truth of absolute rule. It is a powerful argument. It is also a dangerous one, because it can make rumor look like diagnosis and prejudice look like evidence. The secret history, then, is not hidden only in what the emperors did. It is hidden in the act of telling. Every scandal passed through a hand before it reached us. Every accusation survived because someone thought it useful, memorable, morally satisfying, or politically true. The palace after midnight was dark, but the historian's desk was not a clear window into that darkness. It was another room, with its own shadows, its own ambitions, its own carefully sharpened blade. And as we move from the stories themselves to what they meant, we have to remember this. Rome did not merely preserve scandal. Rome interpreted scandal. It turned desire into evidence, evidence into character, character into destiny, and destiny into warning. That is why the reputations of these emperors still feel alive after 2,000 years. Not because every rumor can be proven, but because the writers who carried them forward understood something unsettling about power. That once a ruler becomes too large to judge by ordinary law, people will judge him through stories. And the most damaging stories are often the ones told about what he does when he thinks no one is watching. If we strip these stories down to their most scandalous surfaces, they can seem almost simple. Caligula and his sisters, Claudius and Messalina, Nero and Poppaea, Octavia, Agrippina, Sporus. A procession of rumors, marriages, accusations, humiliations, and deaths. The kind of material that later ages loved because it seemed to confirm an easy lesson. Give one person absolute power, and the palace will become a theater of appetite. There is truth in that lesson, but it is not enough. The scandals were never only about lust. They were about legitimacy, succession, masculinity, female power, the terror of monarchy in a culture that still claimed to hate kings. They were about Rome trying to explain how a state that had once imagined itself governed by laws and citizens had become dependent on the moods, marriages, and private wounds of a single family. That is why the bedroom became so important. It was not because Romans lacked other things to worry about. They had armies on frontiers, grain shipments to protect, provinces to govern, taxes to collect, fires to fear, conspiracies to detect, and senators with memories long enough to make every conversation dangerous. Yet again and again, imperial scandal returned to sex and family. The reason is simple. In the early empire, family was where the future happened. A marriage could decide who belonged near the throne. A pregnancy could create hope or panic. An adoption could rewrite destiny. An affair could make a nobleman look like a rival. A wife could protect a son. A mother could manufacture an emperor. A sister could embody the sacred blood of a dynasty. Or, if rumor turned against her, the corruption of that blood. The private life of the emperor mattered because Rome had placed too much public meaning inside it. This is one of the great contradictions of the imperial system. Augustus had tried to solve civil war by concentrating authority in a single household while pretending that the old republic still breathed. The arrangement worked, in a way. It brought stability, continuity, and a language of restoration. But it also meant that the most intimate parts of that household became matters of state. Once power becomes dynastic, the marriage bed becomes political geography. Who enters it? Who leaves it? Who is born from it? Who is accused of violating it? All of this begins to matter far beyond personal morality. The Romans may have dressed their concern in the language of virtue, but beneath that language was a practical fear. If the emperor's household was unstable, the empire's future was unstable too. This helps explain why accusations against imperial women became so intense. Messalina was not condemned merely as an unfaithful wife. She was remembered as a woman whose desire threatened to form a rival center of power. Agrippina was not feared merely as an ambitious mother. She represented the possibility that the emperor himself could be made, guided, and perhaps controlled by a woman operating through the family rather than formal office. Poppaea was not merely a seduction story. She marked the triumph of Nero's chosen desire over the dynastic wife who had helped legitimate him. Rome often spoke about these women as if they were the disease, but more often, they were symptoms of the system. The empire gave imperial women no official throne, then panicked when they discovered unofficial routes to influence. Marriage, motherhood, proximity, and lineage became their instruments. A woman who used them effectively could be portrayed as unnatural because the sources were written by men who preferred power to wear masculine clothing, even when it was clearly moving through the household. There is a sharp unfairness in this. Roman writers could turn a politically capable woman into a moral monster with remarkable efficiency. They could describe ambition in a man as vigor and ambition in a woman as contamination. They could blame wives and mothers for the anxieties produced by succession politics, as if the women had invented the game rather than been trapped inside it. Messalina may have acted dangerously. Agrippina certainly maneuvered fiercely. Poppaea rose through a court where desire and calculation were difficult to separate. But the moral fury directed at them reveals Rome's fear that power was slipping through channels it could not publicly name. The scandals were also about masculinity, but not in the shallow sense of ancient gossip mocking private behavior. Roman masculinity was a political code. It demanded control, dominance, restraint, and command over the self before command over others. A ruler who appeared ruled by women, by actors, by luxury, by anger, or by desire seemed to fail at the symbolic level before policy was even considered. This is why Nero's stage performances mattered so much to hostile writers. They were not annoyed merely because he enjoyed music. They saw an emperor seeking applause, displaying himself, confusing the hierarchy between ruler and performer. For them, this was not eccentricity. It was evidence. The same logic shaped sexual accusations. A ruler accused of passive roles, theatrical marriages, incest, or uncontrolled lust was being portrayed as a man who had lost the mastery that justified his mastery over others. The body became a political document. Every rumor about appetite was also a claim about authority. This does not mean the accusations were false. It means they were doing more than reporting behavior. They were translating constitutional fear into moral language. Rome had a problem it could never fully admit. The emperor was a monarch. The old hatred of kings had not vanished. It had been buried under titles, ceremonies, and careful fictions. Augustus had made monarchy tolerable by making it look like service. But every bad emperor threatened to expose the arrangement. When Caligula humiliated senators, when Nero performed on stage, when Tiberius withdrew to Capri, each seemed to reveal a different face of kingship. Domination, display, secrecy. Sexual scandal made that revelation easier to condemn. A tyrant, in Roman imagination, did not respect boundaries. He invaded households. He took women. He blurred kinship. He mocked rank. He made citizens into spectators of his private will. So when writers accused emperors of sexual excess, they were often saying, "This man is not a princeps. He is the king we always feared." That is why incest rumors carried such force. They were not only accusations of forbidden desire. They were symbols of a dynasty turning inward until it became unnatural. The imperial family claimed legitimacy through blood, but blood could become too concentrated, too sacred, too dangerous. Caligula's alleged relationship with his sisters, marked as uncertain in the evidence, endured because it made a political point with brutal clarity. The family that ruled Rome was imagined as collapsing into itself. The same is true of adultery. In ordinary moral language, adultery violated a marriage. In dynastic politics, it threatened the certainty of heirs. It raised questions about loyalty, influence, and bloodline. It made private betrayal look like public sabotage. That is why Augustus punished Julia so severely. Why Messalina's alleged marriage to Silius became a political emergency. Why Octavia's displacement stirred sympathy and alarm. The issue was not only who loved whom, it was who could inherit, who could influence, and who could claim to belong. At the center of all this was fear. Fear that succession would fail. Fear that women would rule through the bedchamber. Fear that the Senate had become decorative. Fear that the emperor's appetites could not be restrained. Fear that the palace had replaced the constitution. Fear that the republic's old values had not been restored, but embalmed. The scandals gave Rome a way to speak those fears aloud without always naming the larger truth. It was easier to say Nero was corrupted by desire than to say the Roman world had given one young man enough power for his desires to become lethal. It was easier to call Messalina shameless than to admit that the emperor's marriage could destabilize the state. It was easier to condemn Agrippina as monstrous than to ask why motherhood had become one of the few paths by which a woman could shape imperial succession. The gossip was not separate from politics. It was politics in another register. And this is the final turn in understanding these stories. Scandal helped Rome preserve the illusion that the system was sound, and only certain individuals had polluted it. Bad emperors could be blamed for being lustful, theatrical, weak, or unnatural. Bad women could be blamed for seducing, manipulating, or overreaching. The moral failure could be located in bodies, bedrooms, and personalities. But the deeper instability belonged to the structure itself. A world ruled through one family will always obsess over that family's private life. A state that depends on heirs will obsess over sex. A political culture that denies female office will fear female influence. A monarchy that pretends not to be monarchy will condemn every emperor who makes the truth too visible. So what were the scandals really about? They were about power trying to hide inside morality. They were about a city that judged its rulers through stories of desire because desire revealed where the official language ran out. They were about the frightening discovery that when one household becomes the center of the world, there is no such thing as a merely private failure. Rome remembered the emperors through their bedrooms, not because the bedroom was trivial, but because the bedroom had become one of the places where empire exposed itself. After Caligula was killed, after Nero died, after the first imperial dynasty burned itself into memory, Rome still could not leave their bedrooms alone. That is one of the strangest things about these rulers. Their armies mattered, their laws mattered, their building projects, executions, taxes, games, appointments, and political failures mattered. Yet for centuries, people returned to the intimate scandals: Caligula and his sisters, Nero and his brides, Messalina and Silius, Agrippina and the son who escaped her by destroying her. The stories survived because they were useful. Not useful in the simple sense of being true or false, but useful because they gave later generations a language for absolute power. A bad emperor could be described in administrative terms: poor judgment, fiscal recklessness, cruelty toward elites, military failure, political instability. But those phrases are cold. They do not make the listener feel the danger. Rumor does. Rumor enters through the side door. It carries a scene, not an argument. A closed room, a forbidden relationship, a public humiliation, a mother's influence, a wife's betrayal, a ruler performing where he should command. These images move more easily than policy. They lodge in memory because they turn systems into bodies. They make tyranny visible at human scale. That is why the legends of Caligula and Nero became moral warnings long after their reigns ended. Caligula became the emperor who showed what happens when power loses shame. He was remembered as the man who treated status as a toy, family as a scandal, and dignity as something he could break for entertainment. Whether every story told about him is reliable is not the point of his afterlife. His name became shorthand for the fear that a ruler with no restraints could make reality itself feel unstable. Nero became something slightly different. The emperor as performer, artist, murderer, bridegroom, child of a devouring dynasty and destroyer of the people who made him. He was remembered not only as cruel, but as theatrical. That distinction mattered. Nero did not merely abuse power in the stories told against him. He made power look like self-indulgence. He transformed the imperial role into spectacle and forced Rome to watch. Both legends worked because they simplified. Real reigns are complicated. They contain ordinary administration, competing factions, moments of competence, personal grievances, inherited problems, and events no ruler fully controls. Memory has less patience. It chooses the scene that explains the man. For Caligula, the scene is often the palace as a chamber of humiliation. For Nero, it is the stage, the marriage, the murder, the applause that cannot be refused. This simplification is unfair, but it is powerful. It allowed Rome to turn history into warning. The early empire could be read as a moral sequence. Augustus builds the mask of respectable rule. Tiberius retreats behind secrecy. Caligula exposes domination as spectacle. Claudius lets the household become vulnerable to scandal. Nero turns desire and performance into imperial identity. The sequence is too neat to be entirely true, but it is too meaningful to dismiss. Rumor made the empire narratable. It is worth noticing that official power often tries to control memory, but rumor is harder to govern. A law can be copied. An inscription can be carved. A coin can carry a face across provinces. But a story moves differently. It adapts to the mouth that tells it. It grows sharper when repeated by enemies, softer when retold by sympathizers, stranger when copied by later writers who live in a different moral world. By the time these stories reached later audiences, they had become more than reports. They were exempla, examples, warnings, moral scenes. They could teach what Roman authors believed tyranny looked like from the inside. They could entertain, of course. Scandal has always had an audience, but the best scandals do more than entertain. They organize fear, and Rome had many fears to organize. It feared the return of kingship under another name. It feared dynasties without virtue. It feared heirs produced by uncertain marriages. It feared women who wielded influence without office. It feared young rulers raised inside luxury and flattery. It feared the collapse of old masculine discipline. It feared Eastern luxury, theatrical display, and court culture, replacing the sober fiction of republican restraint. So when later generations repeated the intimate scandals of the Caesars, they were not merely enjoying gossip from a vanished palace. They were rehearsing a political lesson. This is what happens when one household becomes too powerful to correct. The rumor becomes a substitute for accountability. That is a troubling thought. In a healthier political system, wrongdoing might be investigated, restrained, punished through law. In the imperial system, especially when the emperor himself stood above ordinary challenge, moral judgment often arrived late, through narrative. People who could not safely accuse a living ruler could condemn him after death. Historians could make the corpse answer questions the man had avoided. This does not make rumor noble. Rumor can be cruel. It can distort lives beyond recognition. It can turn women into symbols, servants into props, and complicated people into monsters useful for other people's arguments. The women of these stories suffered especially from that process. Julia, Messalina, Agrippina, Poppaea, Octavia, Drusilla, Livilla. Each became part of a vocabulary of scandal that often cared more about what they represented than who they were. But rumor also preserves the pressure points of a society. It tells us where people felt the floor might give way. If a rumor about incest becomes believable, the culture is anxious about bloodline and boundaries. If a rumor about an empress's adultery becomes politically explosive, the culture is anxious about heirs and hidden influence. If a rumor about a ruler's theatrical marriage becomes unforgettable, the culture is anxious about masculine authority and public dignity. The rumor may lie about the event while telling the truth about the fear. That is why these stories are still worth examining. Not because we should accept them all, not because ancient scandal is automatically insight, but because the survival of a rumor is itself a historical fact. Someone told it, someone copied it, someone believed it, or wanted others to believe it. Someone found it useful enough to preserve. And over time, these rumors became part of how Rome judged power. Caligula and Nero were not remembered through ordinary failure. They became negative monuments, warnings carved not in marble, but in narrative. Their private lives, real and imagined, were made to carry the weight of a political verdict. That absolute power does not merely command the state. It invades the self, the family, the body, the meaning of love. This is why the bedroom outlived the battlefield. Battles can decide territory, but scandals decide character. Laws can reveal policy, but rumors reveal what a society is prepared to believe about those who rule it. Rome remembered certain emperors through their intimate lives, because intimacy offered the most direct route to judgment. If the ruler's household was corrupt, then the empire could imagine it had seen the hidden truth of the reign. Perhaps that is the final cruelty of imperial rumor. It turns the private person into a public symbol, and then the symbol becomes stronger than the person ever was. The real Caligula disappears behind the tyrant of legend. The real Nero disappears behind the singer, the murderer, the bridegroom, the burning silhouette that later imagination could not resist. The real women around them disappear behind roles assigned by fear. But the legends endured because they answered a question Rome never stopped asking. What happens when no one can tell the ruler no? The answer, in Rome's memory, was not given through a constitution. It was given through stories of desire without restraint, families without safety, marriages without innocence, and palaces where every closed door might conceal the moral shape of the empire. Rumor became Rome's afterlife for power, and in that afterlife the Caesars never stopped being watched. At the end of these stories, we return to the palace. Not the palace as a simple place of marble halls and guarded doors, but as Rome imagined it. A chamber where love could become policy, where fear could dress itself as morality, where ambition could hide inside marriage, and where rumor could outlive the people it accused. The private lives of the Caesars were never truly private, because the empire had made privacy impossible. Augustus's family had been asked to embody respectability. Tiberius's retreat had taught Rome to fear what it could not see. Caligula's household became a language of violated boundaries. Claudius's marriage to Messalina turned domestic betrayal into a crisis of rule. Agrippina transformed motherhood into a political instrument. Nero's loves, losses, performances, and removals made intimacy look inseparable from danger. But if there is one honest conclusion to draw, it is not that every scandal should be believed. The evidence is too uneven for that. Some stories rest on firmer ground. Nero's murder of Agrippina, Octavia's destruction, Messalina's fall, the political use of marriage and adoption, these stand within clearer historical outlines. Other claims, especially the most lurid accusations against Tiberius and Caligula, remain shaped by hostile authors, elite disgust, moral convention, and the ancient appetite for turning bad rulers into monsters. Yet uncertainty does not make the scandals meaningless. it makes them more revealing. Because what Rome chose to believe, repeat, exaggerate, and preserve tells us what Rome feared. It feared emperors who slipped beyond public restraint. It feared women who gained influence without office. It feared dynasties whose bloodlines could be questioned. It feared young rulers who valued performance more than dignity. It feared that the old republican language of virtue had become a curtain, and behind that curtain stood monarchy, naked and undeniable. This is why desire became such a powerful accusation. Desire seemed to expose the ruler when official ceremony concealed him. The emperor could speak of duty, law, restoration, and tradition. He could appear on coins with calm, divine authority. He could sit in judgment, receive ambassadors, and wear the face of Rome itself. But the stories told about his bedchamber claimed to show what he was when the public mask was gone. That claim was not always fair, but it was potent. Rome turned private desire into a judgment on power because power had entered the private world first. Once one household became the hinge of the state, every marriage mattered. Every heir mattered. Every lover mattered. Every wife, sister, mother, and favorite became a possible road to influence. The palace did not corrupt intimacy from the outside. It made intimacy part of government. And this is the true secret history. Not simply that emperors loved badly, or lusted dangerously, or were slandered by enemies. Not simply that ancient writers enjoyed scandal, though they often did. The deeper truth is that the Roman Empire created a political system in which the ruler's inner life became a public risk. His family was not allowed to be merely human. It had to serve as symbol, succession plan, moral example, and battlefield all at once. No family could bear that weight without breaking somewhere. The Caesars broke in different ways, some through image, some through secrecy, some through spectacle, some through violence, some through the stories others told after they were dead. And the women around them, Julia, Drusilla, Agrippina, Livilla, Messalina, Octavia, Poppaea, were often made to carry the blame for tensions the empire itself had created. So when we hear these scandals now, we should listen carefully, not with blind belief, not with easy dismissal, but with the awareness that rumor, however distorted, can preserve the outline of a wound. Rome's wound was the contradiction at the heart of its empire. It hated kings, yet depended on emperors. It praised virtue, yet rewarded ambition. It claimed public order, yet placed the future of the world inside the most fragile of human arrangements, the family. Behind the curtain of the Caesars, there was no single hidden truth waiting untouched in the dark. There were people. There was power. There was fear. There was memory. There were writers turning fragments into verdicts, and later generations mistaking verdicts for fact. And perhaps that is why these stories still hold us. They remind us that power is never judged only by what it commands in public. It is also judged by what it permits in private, what it excuses, what it destroys, and what stories remain when the doors finally close. The palace is empty now, but the judgment Rome made inside it is still being heard.